This is Microsoft Office. If anybody was around when OpenOffice was first released back about 2000, the difference it's made to the free desktop to have an actual productivity suite is really quite incredible, because before then there was a whole classes of users were pretty much excluded from really seriously considering Linux. At that point, Abbey Word and K-Office weren't very mature. There just was no way you were really going to get people interested, and we've come a long way since then. I'm a freelance journalist. I really got my start in journalism with OpenOffice.org. I must have done at least 60 articles on it. I've also been a technical reviewer on a major book about it. More to the point, I've fallen into tradition about every 2 years or so over the last 8 years of doing a comparison of the two Office suites to see exactly how they stack up against each other. The most recent one was in February in the Linux Journal. That's now available online. Now, obviously, there's a lot of stuff to talk about, so I'd like to just sort of hit some of the heights here and go very briefly with some of the major applications. The comparison I'm talking about, for those who want to have the exact detail, it's OpenOffice.org 3.2 and Microsoft 2007. Okay, first I'd like to talk about some of the basic myths versus realities of the two operating systems. First of all, one of the things that people have this idea is that Microsoft Office is more mature. The implication is got to be have more full features, etc., etc. In fact, OpenOffice.org or its predecessor, Star Office, actually goes back 25 years. The first part of Star Office, when it was a private company in Germany, they came up with the word processor about 1985. So it's quite mature in what's going on. I doubt there's any of that 25-year-old code in it anymore, but it's not a new thing. And another point, the usual thing you get with free software, well, if it's no cost, it can't be very good. In fact, one of the things you'll find, particularly with Writer, the word processor in OpenOffice.org, it was actually designed by the developers who were told, you have to write your own manual on this. So they actually put in all the things they needed to write a good manual. So in fact, like Writer is actually more like FrameMaker, which is a professional tool for doing manuals and desktop layout suitable for books. And this is the stuff they put into Writer because they had to use it, so they were going to make sure they had the things they wanted. Then another thing too, of course, whenever you switch operating systems, or in this case, Office suites, there's a certain period of adjustment. And because people have this assumption, well, that Microsoft Office has got to be better, there's an assumption, well, I can't find the feature exactly where I expect to find it or under a different name. So therefore, it doesn't exist. And in fact, if you use a little bit of imagination, do a little searching through the menus, you almost always find that's not true. You may not have something called auto summary in OpenOffice, but what you do have is something called auto abstract, for example. And with a little bit of imagination, you can usually figure it out. Another one is that, well, that OpenOffice.org is just a clone of Microsoft Office. It's just trying to play catch up. In fact, if you actually get in deeply into OpenOffice.org and use it the way it's designed to be used, as opposed to sort of hacking around and doing things that more or less work, it actually has quite a different orientation and logic. But those are the sort of things that I think is important to look at. The reality really, basically want to really stress before I dive into things, is that really that very comparable Office suite. They're both really mature, they're full of features. There's very little in one that you won't find in the other in some form. How well those things perform can be very different. But you usually find the same basic features. The features that 90% of the users use are probably going to be in both. Now, the things I'll be mainly talking about is first of all, interface and organization, some of the core applications, as to say the word processor, spreadsheets, and the slide presentation, and then a few other features here. The most basic and most obvious thing, OpenOffice has what you might call sort of a classical menu and taskbar structure. And of course, infamously, Microsoft Office went to the so-called ribbon, where they sort of did it, and the ribbon is you sort of do away with the traditional menu and taskbar, and you sort of combine them into one thing. A lot of pro and con has been written about this. Personally, I'm completely neutral on the subject of which of these is better. A lot of people just reacted with the ribbon as, well, it's new, and therefore they didn't like it. People feel so strongly about that. I understand that there are some companies that offer solutions that can take a recent copy of MSO and actually revert it back to classical menus and taskbars for people. So not only do you pay for a proprietary Office suite, they didn't pay for the privilege of converting it back to what it used to be. But objectively speaking, there is no study that has actually proved that either of these interfaces is better or worse than the other. Microsoft has a lot of stuff about how wonderful the ribbon is and how much more productive people feel in it. but it's probably just a little bit biased, I think. It's like asking people for an objective study on, is legalizing marijuana a good thing? You can pretty much tell what perspective somebody comes from what point of view and conclusion they reach. Once you get used to either one, I don't think there's much to worry about either way. This Project Renaissance in OpenOffice did come up with a prototype of a ribbon interface for OpenOffice that they might put in at some point. So far that hasn't happened, and I think it might never happen, but it is up in the air. The online help, both follow the fine old tradition of help that is pretty much useless, to be perfectly honest. The online help of OpenOffice is detailed and totally misses the point usually, and is usually behind schedule, so it's really not worth looking at in any great detail. Microsoft Office has just the opposite problem, fairly succinct and to the point, and as you follow these questions about what do you want to do, it never actually has a question for what you want to do. I'm not a big fan of the online help of either one, so again, they kind of come up fairly evenly. One of the big differences you'll find, Microsoft Office comes loaded with templates that you can just pretty much pick up and use. And by contrast, these are the templates that are available in OpenOffice when you just download it or when you just install. However, there are just as many to download. If you know how to use a search engine, you can compensate for this very, very easily. There are thousands of online templates, so it's just a little extra step to do when you install. I said earlier that the two have a difference in logic. Microsoft Office, it does have the whole idea of styles, you see, but look at all the detailed stuff to manually format things over on the left. Manual formatting, or what I call manual overrides here, that's when you use a word processor, for instance, as a typewriter. That is to say that when you want to put something in bold, you stop and you highlight the individual piece, then you go up and hit the bold button. And of course, when you want to make a change, then you have to go through the entire file and find every instance where you use bold and say if you want to change to italic, change that to italics. They do have styles which will allow you to, just define the style once and then the change ripples through. When you change the style, it just, all the places where that particular style is used automatically update in the document. But it's really de-emphasized, it's not very comfortable to use. Whereas, by contrast, OpenOffice.org is heavily emphasizing on using styles. It assumes, in other words, you're going to invest a little bit of time in learning how to use an Office suite the way it's meant to be used. What a concept, I know. Just from this floating palette of styles and formatting, very, very detailed sort of styles. You don't have to use all the styles by any stretch of the imagination, and you can add your own if you really need to, but pretty much anything you can think of you probably want in a style has already been defined for you in OpenOffice. It also has page styles, which, so you're going into the desktop publishing area. It has frame styles, because every object, like a picture you put in, has a frame that you can manipulate. It has separate frame styles you can define. It also has separate list styles you can define. And that's just within Writer. You'll also find in every other part of OpenOffice, you'll find the same sort of thing. The spreadsheet calc has cell styles that you can define and page styles for when you print out. So it's really very heavily emphasized on styles, so much so that in some cases, if you don't do things in styles, it's almost impossible to actually do something, or it's really, really kludgy to do it. A good example of that being, say, a table of contents. A table of contents is set up as really flexible and you can do a lot of stuff if you use the heading styles in your document. If you don't, you have the alternatives to go through and highlight and mark all the separate pieces that you want to put in your table of contents, which I don't think many people are really going to want to do. Also, the fine control, because in a lot of ways, OpenOffice is, particularly in Writer, for example, it sort of nears desktop publishing. These are the two different dialogues for defining bullet points. You see over MSO over there, you can decide whether you're going to have numbers or bullet points and a few other very basic things. By contrast, if you want to, and this is, I should stress, this is if you want to, because usually the defaults in OpenOffice are pretty safe for most people. You can decide whether you want to put a tab stop after the numbering. You can decide not just left alignments as you'd have on MSO, but a line down to 2 decimal points. The indentation, ditto. This goes throughout the whole thing. I mean, there's a really fine-tuned set of controls which are available for you if you want to. Microsoft Office is along the lines of, well, you get something that looks fairly decent, but don't expect to make too many changes in it. Supported file formats. Microsoft Office supports, guess what? Microsoft Office. Also a few other things like RTF and HTML, MS Works. There's a lot more support for file formats in OpenOffice. Obviously, the default open document format is a free format that can be picked up by other Office suites. It supports Microsoft Office more or less. If you're doing a document that is mostly text-oriented, it'll come across pretty good. Say a brochure layout, and you switch it between the two Office suites, you probably don't want to do it. It also supports DocBook, can read Word perfect. Install the Sun PDF import extension, which is a great extension, by the way. You can import PDF and edit the PDF, which is a really nice touch. In a lot of ways, it's an arms race. If you follow this as closely as I do, you'll notice that each of them borrows from the others. OpenOffice.org Writer has the floating styles and formatting palette. It just sort of floats on your desktop. Soon after OpenOffice.org started getting popular, suddenly Microsoft Office came up with a similar feature. By contrast, one of the latest releases of OpenOffice.org, the zoom feature switched over to the slider bar like Microsoft Office had. You'll find that a lot, particularly in the spreadsheet calc, because obviously Excel is the most widely used spreadsheet in the world. They want to keep compatibility. So if Excel adds a feature, then Calc will throw in the same feature as soon as it can in the next release. If Calc can support 250,000 columns, and why you want to do that in a spreadsheet rather than database escapes me, but never mind. Then suddenly Excel has 250,000 column support. It's pretty close race all the way through. Just a few brief comments about core applications. Basically, Microsoft Word is really suitable for short documents of, say, no more than about 30 pages. It is vaguely possible, and you hear people who are real experts who have spent their life devoted to Microsoft Word, which is a scary concept when you think of it, say they can actually keep a document going of 200 or 300 pages. But for most people who aren't as savvy as rare experts, a Microsoft Word document of 200 pages is going to be in one of two states, corrupted or about to be corrupted. I really would keep under 30 pages there. By contrast, Writer, I can tell of first-hand experience without any special expertise involved. I've done documents of 500 pages, and the only real limit is the actual, the amount of RAM on your machine. If you try and work with 500 pages and you've only got a gigabyte of RAM, then it might grind a little bit. But if you've got 2, it's going to work fine. Word is really oriented towards fast manual formatting. You get up and running quickly. You don't need a lot of expertise to get going. Writer is a little more sophisticated. It takes a bit longer to get ramped up, but when you are ramped up, you've got exactly what you want. And really, you could say Microsoft Word is designed for beginners. Writer is designed for people who are willing to learn and become fairly skilled at it. By contrast, if you want to use free software and you don't want to spend a lot of time learning, then I would say, well, use Abbey Word, the free software equivalent of Microsoft Office, in the sense of it's designed to get you up and running very, very quickly. It has a few less features, but it has all the features that people would actually use. The so-called master document feature, that works extremely well in Writer. It works so poorly in Word that you actually have to hunt to find out how to do that in Office 2007. They've hidden the feature because they don't want people using it. It corrupts files at a tremendous rate. Once or twice, when for my sins, I had to actually work in MS Word when I was working in an office, I would make backup about 5 or 6 times a day because I never knew when it was going to corrupt. The master document feature was going to corrupt. This is first-hand experience I'm talking about. This happened to the point where, gee, it's a good day. It only crashed 3 times. I only had to revert to backup 3 times. So I wouldn't use it in Word for any cost. It really is not designed to be used. Yeah, I've seen some experts say, well, what are you talking about? It's easy to use. Yeah, if you follow all these rules, like you don't do this, you don't do that, and there's about a dozen rules you follow, which means basically don't do any document that has anything more than text, let alone any format, and it worked just fine. So, it's not really functional. The spreadsheets, Excel and Calc in OpenOffice.org, they're both in sort of an arms race to extend features in a big way. But as you might expect, running number 2, Calc is very careful to match function compatibility with Excel. Compatibility on functions in the spreadsheet, which is actually very, very good. The only thing you do have to watch out for, though, is sometimes Calc will have a Excel equivalent of a function, but then it'll also have a Calc version of the same function that's identified with an A at the start of the name. It will have features that the Excel version doesn't have. If you think you want to export this spreadsheet into MSO, you have to make sure that you use the right function. You don't use the Excel compatible function. Otherwise, there's not a lot to prepare in terms of the size of the spreadsheet you can use, the feature sets, like the detectives and scenarios and all the other different little things you can work with functions are pretty much the same. Only real complaint I would have with Calc is that its so-called data pilots, which are the equivalent of Excel's pivot tables, is that the interface is a little clunky for using them. It's not as sophisticated, but it has the same functionality, and once you learn, it's not too bad. I have heard some people say that Excel is better for expert users, but that was a few years ago, and I think that has pretty much died down, and certainly for the average user of spreadsheets. In terms of functionality, and I'm not thinking here, of course, about licensing or anything else, there's not a lot to choose between them in terms of what they can do. Most average users and most average Office users are not going to find a lot of difference between them.
Is there a macro difference?
Well, there's a different macro language, but that's not really a problem because one of the things you can do in OpenOffice, you can write a macro to work within that, but if you're moving back and forth, set a few settings so that macros are preserved even if they're not activated. Even though you can't use a Visual Basic macro in Calc, it'll be preserved so that if somebody opens it in Excel after you've opened it in Calc, the macro will still be there for them. In terms of functionality, the macros are different languages, but again, they're about equivalent in what they can do. Slideshows, pretty comparable for the average person. The only real problem, OpenOffice Impress lags behind PowerPoint. PowerPoint is much better at syncing sound across slides. What you have to do in Impress is basically put a sound clip per slide, which of course is pretty awkward and not nearly as sophisticated. The sound support is gradually improving. I think it'll be a couple of versions before Impress actually matches PowerPoint there. Another thing, they have the presenter view by default in PowerPoint. So if anybody's not familiar with it, it's when you get a little setup where on your machine you see the slide and you see the next slide and you see a little timer, things like that. You can flip back and forth that don't get displayed on the big screen. There is an extension for that. There's a Sun presenter view extension that you can put into Impress, which gives you the same functionality. In fact, I'm using that right now. Where Impress does really excel, I'm sorry, I had to say that at some point, is when it comes with diagrams and object styles, because for some reason, I'm not sure why, but it's kind of ingenious. Way back, probably at least 15 years ago, Impress was given pretty much the same basic engine as the drawing program in OpenOffice, which I'm not really going to talk about. So it has all sorts of drawing features which are far in advance of what PowerPoint has. So if you need to do a diagram, a chart, or say an office organization, it's far quicker and easier to do it in Impress than it is in PowerPoint. It also includes a little bit of somewhat cheesy, animated GIF stuff as well, which I don't suggest using, but it's there if you want it. Other features in general for the Office suite, as I mentioned, OpenOffice.org includes PDF export, and if you get the right extension, import. Both include a database. You have Access, of course, in Microsoft Office. You have one called Basic in OpenOffice. Doesn't get a whole lot of use and probably shouldn't. What you want to do in OpenOffice is work with a powerful database. It does do a very good job of syncing up with other databases like MySQL and that. Other things, of course, with Microsoft Office, it depends very much on which version, and what they have, 7 versions, I think, right now. You can get Outlook, Visio for diagramming, Publisher. OpenOffice.org doesn't have anything really like Outlook, but I have seen several people try to bundle it with Mozilla Thunderbird, and that works pretty well. Of course, you can always use Evolution as well. Visio, the nearest equivalent really in OpenOffice is Draw, which is a SVG graphics program. It tends to get overlooked, but it can be quite powerful. It's also very good if you don't want to use the desktop publishing in Writer, say if you're working with kids group or an elementary school class or something, you can use Draw as a really simple desktop publishing program as well, and it works very well. Because unlike a lot of drawing programs, it supports multiple pages. And between Writer and Draw, you get a far better package for desktop publishing than Microsoft Publisher can possibly offers. So it really works out fairly well. Another major difference, Microsoft has tried to create a culture of extension creation in Microsoft Office. It's had some success, moderate success I would say, but by contrast, the OpenOffice effort to create a culture of people writing extensions has been hugely successful. That's why I say that Microsoft has dozens of extensions for its Office suite, whereas you get hundreds for OpenOffice. You can get lost in looking at all the details of, some of the stuff is like support for particular language and that you may not be interested in, but it's second really only to the Firefox extensions that are available in sheer variety. Now that's the things I wanted to mention in my more formal part of the presentation, but I'd just like to summarize before I sort of turn it over to questions. In terms of interface and overall feature set, there's not much difference between the two. In the case of the word processors, Writer is vastly superior to MS Word. No question about it in terms of what you can do with it. It really is a tool that for people who really want hands-on control of what they're doing. The spreadsheets, I think, is pretty much a tie. In the slideshows, PowerPoint is pretty much a tie. Otherwise, I think it comes down a lot to what you prefer. Microsoft is ease of use, get up running quickly. OpenOffice is much more stable, and you can customize it to your heart's content. Quite aside from the fact of being a free software advocate, just on a technical aspect, and as somebody who uses Office suites, to me, OpenOffice stability, of course, was a big thing, but just the customization makes it a big winner as far as I'm concerned. It's just possible that speaking here today, I might be a wee bit biased. So There are things that I think that Microsoft Office does do somewhat better. However, I think that by and large, the advantage is with OpenOffice. In cases where one is better than the other, wait a couple of releases, you'll probably see lacks corrected, because it is an arms race, even though it's an undeclared one. People obviously do the development on both, follow what's happening in the other fairly closely. Okay, so are there any questions?
If you have to share documents with Windows Office, is the export to Windows format useful? Or?
It's pretty good. The fancier the layout, the more problems you're going to have. If you're doing something like a brochure with a lot of layout, then it doesn't really matter which direction you're going. You're likely to have problems unless you're really lucky. By and large, I would say that OpenOffice is better at taking Microsoft Office documents than vice versa.
If you take OpenOffice 3. Whatever they are now, compared to taking a document that's written in Word 7 and open it on several older versions, I mean, that's one of the bugbears. Open the document and the format was all slightly.
Backwards compatibility, it depends partly on what you save in. Quick history here, when OpenOffice first came out, it had its own format. I think it went to version 2.0 if I remember correctly. Then it switched over to the open document format. It still supports the earlier formats, absolutely. The advantage of free and open source software, there's no reason to take this out. When I give that list of formats that were supported, I didn't even bother talking about the old star formats from 20 years ago that it still supports. Nobody sees any reason to take it out. If there's one person using it, then it probably will stay in forever. So that's not a problem in OpenOffice. It could be a major problem in Microsoft Office.
Why does OpenOffice.org have such a silly name?
OpenOffice has been trademarked by other companies. The only way they could get distinct identity was to add the .org to it. They insist that the name is OpenOffice.org, so I try when talking about it to say .org, but usually I get lazy and start talking about OpenOffice. I think everybody does the same thing. OpenOffice was trademarked by a company that makes light, airy desktop furniture.
Oh, we don't say MicrosoftOffice.com. The .org is the silly part.
Yeah, that's true.
Name Linux, that's a pretty good name.
Names really are secondary. What is the brand value associated with that name?
It's an interesting point, I think, but most people refer to OpenOffice in casual conversation, so I think it takes care of itself.
Does OpenOffice integrate well with LaTeX?
They've got an extension for it. I hear good reports of it, but I haven't had a chance to try it out, actually. OpenOffice.org does have its own bibliography arrangement. It's a little cumbersome. You might get a little confused about how to use it, because for some reason, it ships with a sample bibliography, which is set up wrongly to actually use it, and has done for a number of years. Not to blow my own horn, but if you look under my name, plus bibliography and OpenOffice.org, I have an article explaining how to actually use it. And one of the first things you have to do is ignore the sample. It's not as good as Biblio, but I think for a lot of people, certainly for university students, it's probably good enough if you don't want to start messing around with another connection. One of the places where OpenOffice.org has really worked well is providing tie-ins for different database formats, different languages for writing extensions. So it's extremely flexible that way. Part of that's necessity because OpenOffice.org code is really, really messy. And rumor has that only 3 people have ever actually mastered it, 2 of which went crazy and 1 of which promptly forgot it. It's really helped development, though, by letting people choose a wide variety of language to write extensions and plugins with, and that's really helped.
What language is it written in?
Java. There's very little of the code from 25 years ago still in OpenOffice, I'm pretty sure. Sun, until recently, now Oracle, were the owners of OpenOffice.org. Of course it's going to support Java. Sun made a lot of really good extensions, and of course they chose Java. That caused a bit of problems when Java code wasn't fully released, but nowadays it's not really much of a problem. It also supports things like Python. It has its own macro language. The extensions can be written in anything, and they've got the bridges to connect up with the core functionality.
Other than the fact that it's free, what would you say is the most appealing reason for an old user of Microsoft Office to switch to OpenOffice?
Stability would probably be high on my list. Also, if you want something more powerful to use.
Real penetration until things like the Outlook until it just becomes a suite.
Microsoft Office has an all-in-one solution. When you deal with free software, there's still a tendency from the grand old Unix tradition, each program doing one thing. An Office suite is one big one thing. Some of this stuff like OneNote and that, you can get that if you look around in free software. You can find equivalents like some of the things we talked about, Basket for OneNote, for example. It's just not bundled together.
I don't think they want to mess around with that.
if they're going in cold, yeah, I agree with you. But where you normally find free software adaptation, it's usually because you already have some knowledgeable people. I don't think there's many cases, at least not in my experience, where people jump in totally cold, one day say, I'm going to go to free software, forget and dump things. There's usually some enthusiasts driving it. It wouldn't be a bad thing just to bundle OpenOffice with all the other stuff that it needs, as a single package to install, or a set of packages to install in the distribution, or put it on the same CD so people are aware of it. Because, I think people miss the stuff because they're not aware of it.
Yeah, it's one installer and then it goes and just puts all of the required packages for GIMP together.
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that's worth doing, because for a lot of average users, an Office suite is really basic, and they're conditioned by having only one package, so that's what they expect. It's not really surprising that people should want that. Okay, I think we're just about out of time. Thank you everybody for coming, and